So I've titled today's lecture Softwareization and Design Sociotechnics. And for me, the term softwareization really starts with this phrase, everything is software. Now this phrase is a direct reference to a set of ideas that are coined by the media theorist Latmanovich, which describe processes by which things become consumed by software. In his book, Software Takes Command, Manovich lays out various ways media, and to a large extent the labor of design, have become softwareized. Simply put, the term suggests that almost all creative labor today takes place within software applications. You all are probably very familiar with this. Now, while this may seem kind of obvious, especially now in the time of remote working and hybrid teaching, etc., what I think goes overlooked is the extent to which everything around us has become software or softwareized. This is happening so closely under our noses and subtly that I don't think it's been critically examined at length. And so part of my research interest for a while now has been this quotidian softwareization, which is a kind of boring or mundane kind of digital revolution that I see happening around us. So for example, here you see on the left an image from Twitter. As Alan mentioned, I spend a lot of my time on Twitter. And here we see a coffee maker that has software that verifies whether the coffee pod that you've inserted is genuine, Keurig, or not. On the right, you see a picture that I took at an Apple store of an electric toothbrush that is supposedly built-in artificial intelligence. So all the devices around us are becoming software. And I don't think it gets any more quotidian or even mundane than that, software with artificial intelligence. This is another example of a softwareization trend, which is to make all objects in our domestic sphere Wi-Fi enabled. I'm sure you've seen varieties of this type of ad. It's difficult to know exactly why a toilet and shower needs to be connected to Wi-Fi. And what I think more abstractly, that these devices are putting forth an idea of a radical softwareization of the domestic sphere. This concept probably began with the notion of a smart house, which is today, unfortunately, not an entire domestic product, but actually is more of a piecemeal assemblage, and we can probably attribute some of that to Rainer Bannon's notion of domestic gadgetry, where the home is not something that's totally designed as an object, but actually more of an assortment of domestic gadgets. And so the process of design is also becoming softwareized. Now this is perhaps more in line with what Manovich is arguing, but I think the kind of techno-fetishism and positivism that goes along with the previous example of artificially intelligent toothbrushes also exists in design software. Right? Here you see design tools advertised as professional home design software, as if the software is really what's going to be in charge of designing your house. Or from a different point of view, big companies like Autodesk use terms like endless possibilities to suggest that their tools have limitless potential. And yet they showcase that limitless potential by showing an extremely mundane and average building in the advertisement. So there's a weird disconnect here between the actual creative potential of a tool like BIM and the imagination of a software company. Like, what does the software company actually perceive is innovative architecture? And this disconnect is interesting because on the one hand, you've got the hyperbolic language like infinite canvas or limitless possibilities. Those words are being used to sell certain tools, but on the other hand, these tools are also quite restricted, right? There's no such thing as an infinite canvas. There is just computationally a limit to all of these environments, and moreover, they're pretty restricted, as anybody that's used any of these tools can attest. And so the reason I'm focusing on these types of ads is that I fundamentally believe that advertisements reflect broader cultural values, and particularly in instances of American capitalism. They're entwined in processes of identity construction. So that's to say that the advertisements produce as well as reflect subjects and subjectivities. So when Adobe says something like, the creative world runs on Photoshop, it's both a wishful statement as well as an observation on the fact that Photoshop is pretty much an industry standard software. And so somebody that uses Photoshop, a Photoshop user, is maybe at odds with another type of user that does not use Photoshop. Now, obviously, Photoshop, for instance, not only has a huge market share of the graphics editing industry, but it's also infiltrated our consciousness in the way that we speak. Despite what Adobe puts on their website under terms of use, people do say images are photoshopped, even though the software used to edit a photograph may not have been Photoshop. So the word has become larger than Adobe itself. And even though Adobe says that legally you cannot say the word Photoshop without saying Adobe Photoshop, it has become kind of like the brand Kleenex, right? Where the word Kleenex refers to the tissue, so the generic object. And I think what's interesting is that people rarely call attention to this new consciousness. This is a particularly telling instance where journalists were saying that this image was photoshopped, but the White House responded that it couldn't have been photoshopped because they used Apple software, not Adobe Photoshop. Now, of course, the broader cultural consciousness reveals itself here because everybody knows that the term Photoshop doesn't have to refer to Adobe Photoshop, right? It just means something's been digitally altered. And so as designers, but also as people, we have to come to terms with this new consciousness. The way that many of us who engage with software on a daily basis see the world is now largely through analogies to computational systems, whether we like it or not. There's been a somewhat undocumented shift in our perception of the world as a result of daily interactions with software. So for example, here, saying that a printed picture is like Instagram in real life. As absurd as that may seem, this is really how a lot of people see the world. We've come full circle in terms of history, in terms of the history of media, where instead of describing mediums in reference to newer mediums, we're describing older mediums. We're describing older mediums in reference to newer mediums, right, as opposed to the other way around. And so to see this new consciousness working, we might look at Zoom as an example. Those of us that spent most of the last few years on Zoom, for instance, might look at this medieval depiction of Noah's Ark without any context. And our brain's going to immediately perceive this as somehow related to Zoom or video calling environments, right? Now this phenomenon is partially summarized in a way, theoretically, in Meredith Ann Hoy's book, From Point to Pixel, A Genealogy of Digital Aesthetics, where she states that the digital is placed in an expanded field so that it is a mechanism, a process, and a constructed method that operates well beyond the boundaries of computational technology. Once digitality is disaggregated from the contemporary electronic computers, it becomes a category that can be used to address works of art, techniques, technologies that may speak in a different language and thus require a different interpretive framework than pictures, artifacts configured through analog processes. In other words, if we detach digital media from the computer, and here's Matt, we can also start to see exactly how this softwareization of our lives is shifting how we perceive the world around us. These juxtapositions not only reveal how we're starting to describe the world around us in relation to interfaces, but also how we're, in a way, rewriting history when we compare historical imagery to contemporary familiar images. It becomes a kind of ingrained trauma from the everyday experience of software. And in a way, we're using the lens of software to look back at ourselves and our own history. More specifically, for designers and architects, software starts to open up different ways, not only of perceiving the world, but also for depicting and designing it, right? That's why you're all here. This Louis Vuitton store by Virgil Abloh can thus be understood as a software-based aesthetic that comes from the tradition of monochrome clay rendering techniques. This type of aesthetic does not exist without the default settings in most 3D software. right? The fact that in a lot of rendering engines, whether it's 3D Studio Max, Maya, Rhino, etc., where the base material is often a matte clay material, that when you hit render, it produces an instant image. The more often that we see this image appear over and over again, it kind of constitutes it becomes ingrained in our culture so much that people start to depict images that are not software-based in relationship to that software. So here we see an installation by Daniel Arsham and an installation by Roxy Payne, where the notion of a homogeneous material plays with our familiarity with digital tools. And if you know about clay rendering, you can sort of feel the digitality, even though these are physical installations. Anyone that has experience with V-Ray or any other ray tracing software can immediately create these associations, and they feed back on themselves, just like the Instagram IRL example. Equally, the work of Meme Studio, here there's an overt reference to software processes, even if they're not clearly stated. It becomes a new type of inside language that we all speak to ourselves, and almost as a kind of inside joke to how the labor of design is enacted in the contemporary moment. Now the problem here, or what I find a little worrisome, is that on top of affecting how we perceive design objects and environments, software also has the potential to make exciting things, or potentially exciting things, very boring and very mundane pretty quickly. Something that appears at first as incredibly innovative and novel, like neural network style transfers, eventually just becomes a button in industry standard software like Photoshop. Before many people have had the chance to study or even critically analyze these tools, the people at Adobe have already, 1, acquired the technology, 2, standardized it, 3, packaged it, and 4, sold it as a plugin or as part of the next update. And so the pace at which we're developing these technologies, unfortunately, leaves little time to reflect on. Moreover, this year we saw a kind of arms race in the text-to-image AI software field with software tools like Midjourney and DALL-E. This software, if you're not familiar with it, allows the construction of images with only a few text prompts, making it super easy to produce things, but not so easy to see under the hood. Now these are extremely black box systems that leverage novelty and ease of use to gain users. And anytime that you are invited to try out a software for free, you are most likely the product yourself. Now I started using Midjourney in early March as part of the beta, and I produced a set of images, but I quickly grew bored. And that's because I think the interpolation aspect is really interesting. So in other words, what these systems are really good at is blending a whole bunch of images together and picking out parts that make sense based on your text prompts and the aggregation of data. But everything eventually started to look the same. And I also wanted access to the training data. I wanted to know how these images were derived. And so eventually I got bored and I stopped using it, especially when they started asking for my money. Now there's other software, such as Runway ML, that's probably on the other side of the spectrum of user-friendly AI. In contrast to Midjourney or DALL-E, Runway is a kind of graphical user interface for training and implementing your own neural net models. And you can do things like facial recognition, image manipulation, body tracking, etc. And it was designed for creative professionals, so it's very user-friendly and accessible, but it still obfuscates most of the algorithms, code, and data that are central to these processes. And so while it's a step forward in terms of transparency, it's still a black box system. Now, Runway does have a team of advisors that brought up issues of ethics and bias in machine learning. You may be aware that a lot of artificially intelligent models have inherent biases and ethical problems. And they acknowledge that it's not a perfect system, But of course, there are a lot of other software developers that don't have the same ethical values and don't actually have disclaimers like this as part of their software systems. And what I think is important to be aware of in this growing landscape of automated technologies are the value systems that are being perpetuated. In these systems, we see things like banned phrases, banned imagery, and a lot of cultural preferences as well, right? Who is in charge of picking the banned phrases is a pretty important question. And so a critique of software can never just be about the software itself. It's also about the social effect and the culture that surrounds it. I mean, think about the fact that Midjourney, if you're familiar with it, runs on a Discord server. It runs as a social mechanism, right? You are in the midst of thousands and thousands of other people creating images together. And if you don't acknowledge that as a social phenomenon, then you're only getting half the picture. And so we should always be aware of the fact that technology is social. There is no technology that is not social. Now, all of these observations are a continuation of the ideas that were first established in my book, Digital Fabrications, Designer Stories for a Software-Based Planet. The book itself is a collection of short essays on software and design with an emphasis on the quotidian and the overlooked shifts in what I've been referring to as this new digital consciousness. A key argument that's brought up in the book is that the landscape of design software is so incredibly vast today that we need, one, new pedagogical models for teaching software, and two, new conceptual models for describing software in general. Architecture and design have gotten pretty far with a kind of tinker attitude where individuals play with different technologies and push their limits. But at a certain point, we need ways to teach and codify these methods for tinkering, right? We need to find ways to teach how to hack these systems and break them apart if we want to know more about them. This chart that I made as part of the book starts to map out certain categories of software related to different oppositions, such as narrative versus document, passive versus active, and silicon versus human. Now within this chart, software is mapped dynamically, meaning that no tool is stuck in one category. In this case, for example, animation software, sorry, I'm looking at the image on the right. For example, one of the axes is isolated, and we're looking at things like animation software in relation to passive users versus active users. And you'll see that animation software is more towards the passive user spectrum because to experience an animation, you typically stand back and you observe it, whereas a video game, you're much more active as a user. And of course, there's a lot of other software tools and instruments that exist within that spectrum and maybe oscillate around. And so what was really important for me when I was making this map of the landscape of software is that things be dynamic, right? You can have hybrid mediums. You can have meta mediums, right? That's the cool new thing about the digital world. And all of this research on softwareization exaggerates the social aspects of technology. It could be bracketed under the broad category of sociotechnics, which is essentially the interaction and feedback loop between technology and people. And in a way, what my book argues for is a closer examination of software's sociotechnics, the relationship between social behaviors, culture, and advanced technologies, specifically in architectural design. And so we can see things that are technosocial and everything from the managerial turn in architectural design to architectural pedagogy. So for example, the position of BIM manager at an architectural firm is a relatively new position that didn't exist in the age of CAD. The workplace, for example, has undergone a huge shift in office structure just because of our changing software systems. To be in an office today, you require a set of technical knowledge that just wasn't there a couple of decades ago. Even just having a dedicated software problem solver in an office is a testament not only to design's reliance on these systems, but also the social role of these systems. Think about your relationship to the IT guy in the office. In the late 20th century, we were promised a future where the computer would perhaps liberate our imaginations or take care of most menial tasks so that people could quote, think big. But in actuality, software evolved with us as a kind of collaborator. At the same time that firms were adopting CAD technologies to make their work more efficient, for example, software's psychological impact became immediately evident. The frustration that we encounter when a computer doesn't do what we want to do was already impacting architectural offices in the 1980s. At the firm MBBJ, CAD operators had these stress balls called CAD blasters, and they would throw it at the screen whenever they were frustrated. So the computer, in a way, was far from the subservient being, the kind of slave that was described in the 1950s by some technologists, never really came to be. It was more of an antagonistic coworker than anything else. And this is something that's still happening today. I'm sure it happens in studio all the time for you guys. It's particularly telling when I see social media posts like these. These are perhaps the most honest depictions of our relationship to technology today that we just overlook and we kind of laugh at and we never think twice about. But really, what does it mean to get an error message like this that says you've done something wrong? What is right and wrong in software? In researching these episodes where the psychosocial effects of software seep into the surface, I've become fascinated by these types of diagrams that try to communicate the conceptual framework of graphical user interfaces. This one, for example, is from the first Macintosh user manual, and it shows the concepts of a file, document, window, and desktop, these things that we kind of take for granted. And it shows how uniquely spatial they are, that the file is a box, the document is a vector, the desktop is an orthographic drawing, the window is also an orthographic plane on top of the desktop. This one here illustrates the concept of scrolling from the Apple II manual. Now, this kind of skeuomorphic representation of scrolling reappears from time to time to illustrate the flatness in the space of the screen. And even though these were initially geared towards explaining to novice computer users how scrolling works, what does it mean to move something up and down on a page or on a screen, they're still being used today as if we haven't really moved forward in terms of our understanding of the space of the screen. This brings up a question of conceptual representation. Is there a way to move beyond the skeuomorph? Do computing environments have to be iconographic? Do we have to rely on the floppy disk to represent save all the time? Why are we trapped with these models of interfaces, of familiarity? I heard someone recently say that we could refer to files and documents as stars and asteroids, and they would still function in the same way. And if you really think about it, there's really no need to call a digital file a file, right? It could be any container. It could be any sort of descriptive container of information. That's really what it is. And to me, personally, it's upsetting that the language of business is really the one that we use for computation. What are other forms of language that we can use to describe computation? What are other forms of representation that we can use to produce or to reflect our own relationship to computation? I firmly believe that breaking apart traditional modes of representing computing systems and introducing more abstraction and mysticism related to things like literature and art can produce new world views on computation. Software doesn't really have to be an analog of the physical world. And that's basically to say that we should regard software design, just like architecture, as a world-making exercise. The making of software is more than the making of a tool, and it's really evolved into the making of worlds. For example, the coordinate system of any 3D environment is perhaps the easiest place to understand this subjectivity. More often than not, there's a discrepancy between the orientation of 3D worlds and software. Some of you might be familiar with this. Different software represents environments differently, according to some whim of the developers, which most likely comes from their disciplinary applications or disciplinary conventions. For drafting software, for example, developers imagined their world as being laid out in an XY plane corresponding to a sheet of paper on a drafting table, with the z-axis being extruded off the page. Other software describes their world differently, right? Think about how you move from world to world when you move a file for 3D printing or for rendering, etc. And so given the state of softwareization that we're in, what my design work has tried to do in recent years is put forth alternative modes of working with and around software. This often takes the form of making custom tools where the main purpose is not productivity or a useful artifact, but rather the goal is to produce some kind of an experience. I've been calling these explorations useless software, because the goal is to establish a way of working that does not prioritize the end product. Now, useless may be a tricky term, but I use it to suggest an anti-productive mission. Useless software tries to be compassionate, meaning that it tries to avoid telling somebody that interacts with it that what they're doing is wrong or incorrect. If we regard our current relationship to software as something less than amicable, perhaps even cruel, then it becomes incredibly necessary to rethink that relationship, right? We don't want to be in a toxic relationship with our software. Can we go beyond fatal error messages? Can we go beyond this notion of just having to choose between okay and cancel? What's the in-between here? And if we do have to engage with productivity software, can we find ways to subvert traditional uses of these market-driven applications? Can we, here, for example, the theorist Ian Bogost is writing a melancholy reflection on the history of Photoshop in his crash report as a meditative exercise. I don't know how many of you have actually written anything in this crash report, but here's something that you can try out. Can we create poetic experiences out of our social relationships to software? We already use these systems every day. What if we just started looking at them a little bit differently? I love this quote from the School for Poetic Computation class, Digital Love Languages, that says, what if all the software we use was made by people who love us? I'm pretty sure most of us will agree that the software that we use on a daily basis was not made by people who love us. Can the labor that we enact within software be more playful and engaging? Video games, for example, have been at the sort of forefront of this quest to de-incentivize virtual productivity. This one that I'm showing here is a quirky take on the experience of going to art school, where your goal is basically to just wander around an art school campus and make art as little assignments. This one is called A Short Hike, where the main premise is just a hike. It's built from the tradition of open world exploration games, and here you play a character whose only goal is to make it to the top of the mountain in any way that you can. But you can take your time getting there. There's no time limit. And you can go fishing, you can walk around aimlessly and just play freely. Why can't BIM software be more like this? It's built on the same infrastructure. In a way, these types of software and these games operate very much like fidget spinners. If you guys remember fidget spinners. They don't really provide anything other than delight. And the only thing at stake is a satisfying experience. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And probably something we need more of today, right? This idea of fidgeting. So in terms of my own work, personally and within Office COB, the question of uselessness is always at the forefront. For many of our installation projects, we build little applications that serve no real purpose than to play or just to draw. We don't make apps that augment the installation virtually. That would be too useful. We like to think of these as toys that go along with the physical environment, like something you would get in a Happy Meal along with the installation. Here's one of the first apps that we ever built in 2018, that went along with our Noodle Soup installation in Chicago. So there was the physical component of the installation, But the virtual component was almost just like an exploratory game where you got to experience the different situations that you might experience in real life. And it's supposed to be glitchy. Sorry. This was a small installation that we did at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago during COVID. Here, the app was the main feature, and it was a collaborative painting app that allowed for simultaneous abstract painting experiences. You can go to this right now if you want and paint together at ourpaper.space. And the main premise of this project was that we're all trapped inside together. And funnily enough, we started developing this app before COVID, but then we went into lockdown, and it became doubly as important to find ways to interact with one another that was probably more exciting than just looking at each other on Zoom. And so what this really is an anonymous painting app where you can just have a painting experience as soon as you log on with random anonymous strangers. We also recently built an app for our lightweight construction installation at Woodbury University. This was a project about digital representation and the digitality of construction materials. Some of you may have seen this in person. And something that you might notice about these apps that I'm showing is that they all make use of a non-realistic perspective. We tend to use architectural conventions such as orthographic drawing or parallel projection because these communicate a disciplinary history as well as a level of abstraction that distinguishes the space of the screen from the physical space. We don't make VR worlds that use perspective because that would be too skeuomorphic for us. We're interested in what architecture can bring to computation, not the other way around. And we're also interested in other ways of experiencing virtual space. And we're growing increasingly interested in the phenomenon of digital painting because it seems to summarize a lot of what I've been interested in. How can we leverage the pixel and real-time technology to reflect on acts of painting and drawing, which are fundamental to architectural representation, right? We paint and we draw all the time. But what else can the screen do when we put marks on it? Can it push back on us? I think we already feel that the screen and the system pushes back on us in a negative way, but can it push back on us in a more positive way? Our project Islands, which you can access at islands.inc, is a painting program that explores the idea of feedback as a way to produce an image out of gestures. So here you draw like you draw in any typical drawing software, but the system provides a kind of video feedback instantaneously and moves the paint that you just put on the surface around. And so the flow and the distortion is a kind of collaboration with the system itself. And this foray into digital painting applications has become a kind of personal obsession for me. So beyond the work that we're doing at Office Ka, I've also started making my own custom painting software that generates animated digital paintings. Now, I'm not trained as a software developer, so these tools are relatively simple in their structure, but they do some things that, for example, Photoshop just can't do. So as a way of concluding, I just wanted to go through one of these applications and show you how it works. Because I really see this as a core part of my practice and the almost inevitable culmination of the research that I've been doing. For me, to really be able to critique design software, I can't just write and speculate. I also have to engage in the act of building software at some level. So I'm going to, this is where we get kind of experimental. See this? Yeah. Okay. So I've been building these custom painting tools with a lot of different programming languages, primarily processing, P5.js, JavaScript, and OpenGL shading language, which is a little bit more advanced. But there's really not that much to these applications. If anybody's familiar with processing, you'd probably be able to identify what I'm doing here pretty easily. And so the processing creative coding language is built on top of the Java programming language, but it makes drawing really, really easy because you can use pretty intuitive functions, kind of like in Rhino, where you say you want to draw a line, you draw a line, you want to draw a rectangle, you draw a rectangle, but you can automate that process pretty quickly. And so processing has a really rich history of innovators in both art design and architecture. But here, what I'm doing in this custom software is I'm creating a canvas and I'm loading the interface with typical painting tools that you might have. So I've got a color picker here. This is just an image of a spectrum of RGB color values. And then I've got my drawing canvas, and you'll see that I've got this little circle that follows my cursor, right? So I'm using the logics of painting software that haven't really changed very much in, 60 years of computer development. But I'm doing something kind of interesting with it. I implemented a looping system so that when I place down a mark on the canvas, the gesture is recorded and it repaints over and over again. So I can just keep painting in different spots and you see those gestures reappear, right? This is something that maybe potentially you could do with Photoshop Actions, but my interface I think is a little bit more exciting. And you can keep changing colors and you can keep painting. And the way that the paint is kind of flowing is based off of this feedback effect that I was experimenting with in the Islands application, which is essentially taking an image of the canvas that you see and feeding it back to the canvas, but distorting the location of the pixels a little bit according to some mathematical rules, which creates a kind of flow. So this software itself will produce a seamless looping animation because I'm also using what's called a four-dimensional noise. It's a little bit technical, but it basically says that the distortion of the feedback will loop around on itself. And so if you look at this for long enough, you'll see that it just keeps going forever in the same cycle, even though it looks kind of chaotic. And for me, this was a kind of watershed moment in my design practice because this has no aim. This is a totally useless tool in terms of making something productive, right? This is purely just an expressive experience. And building these during lockdown and during the pandemic was a really meditative experience for me. And I found it very, very rewarding. And I think I gained a much broader appreciation for software development and perhaps another route that it can take. Thank you.